Well, thank you for having me here and for everybody who's made the effort to be out here to talk about something that's incredibly important for all of us, certainly for me. My name's Shawn Henry, Chief Security Officer at CrowdStrike. I'm going to kind of tie a lot of these things together because I've been listening to the different speakers throughout the day, and I don't know that there's a lot that I'm going to be able to tell you that's brand new, but I want to try and tie together a couple of the concepts so that we can kind of bring it all together in a cohesive fashion. Before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about how I ended up here at CrowdStrike and some of my background. So I grew up in New York City, born in Queens, grew up on Long Island. My father was a New York City detective. My brother is currently a New York City detective assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI. My uncle was an NYPD officer, a lot of my friends. And I was always interested in the law enforcement role. I thought I'd be a police officer at some point as a kid growing up. And then when I was a senior in high school, I had a family friend who graduated from the FBI National Academy. And I had the privilege of going down and seeing this graduation and him going through that ceremony. And I remember very, very distinctly walking into the FBI Academy and as an 18-year-old high school senior and just saying, I am coming here. It was very vivid, the vision of that occurring. And everything that I did from that day forward was really preparing me to go into the Bureau. 8 years later, I walked across that stage, I got my credentials, and I then spent the next 24 years in the FBI. It was an incredible experience for me. I was engaged in some of the biggest investigations globally. I had 13 different positions over the course of my 24 years, working in 4 different cities, 3 different field offices. Terrorism cases, attempted terrorism attacks, shootings, mass shootings, violent crimes, innocent images, child pornography cases, and a lot of the big, early on in the late 90s and early 2000s, kind of the first attacks, denial of service attacks against e-commerce, some of the breaches, love bug virus, and all those sorts of things. So it was just, for me, just an incredible period in my life. I don't say that to you to be kind of boastful. I say it because I've been in the middle of this fight in security for more than 30 years. And I've seen an awful lot during the course of that time. I've seen the adversary techniques change. I've seen the adversaries' capabilities. I've seen their intent. I know who the adversaries are in lots of different venues. But I've also learned that there's a lot more similarities between the physical world and the virtual world than there are differences. And a lot of the techniques that I was engaged in, terrorism, violent crimes, public corruption, organized crime, financial fraud, etc., have migrated to the network, and the adversaries are now using the capabilities of technology to enhance their capabilities and their opportunities to hurt and harm folks around the world. As I neared my retirement, I didn't know how I was going to find that same sense of mission and purpose and commitment and that same adrenaline rush that I got every single day when I went in and helped to protect this country. I worked with some of the finest men and women around the world, dedicating their lives, spending and sacrificing a lot of effort and a lot of time to keep everybody safe. But then I met George Kurtz, CEO of CrowdStrike, and Dmitry Alperovich, the CTO, who you heard speak earlier today, and the two of them talked about kind of this vision about where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do, and the concept of this organization where they wanted to be the best security firm in the world, helping organizations better protect their infrastructure, developing the right technology, the right policies and capabilities to allow people to remain safe and to be much safer in their day-to-day enterprise. And it took an awful lot of convincing for me to make that change and go over to CrowdStrike, because I was leaving as an executive of a 34,000 person organization, $10 billion plus budget, to a company that at the time had less than 20 people. They had 0 products developed. They had nothing that they could sell at that time other than some professional services, but it was really more about this idea and this philosophy and the vision to actually do something that would allow the infrastructure to be safe. And I knew in my time in the Bureau, having worked developing U.S. government policy and strategy going back to the mid-2000s, back when Einstein was being developed, and I know there are folks in the room that were there at the time, and the concepts and the ideas were good, but it wasn't going to happen, and I really thought that the private sector was going to have to be the ones to innovate and help protect U.S. and global infrastructure, that the private sector had the capabilities and had the knowledge and the opportunities to develop those sorts of programs. So I moved. I kind of picked up and I retired from the FBI. It was a sad day at the time, but I really decided afterwards, within the first couple of months, that it absolutely was the right decision, because I was pretty quickly engaged in some of the biggest investigations from the private sector side, where we could bring our technology and we could bring our capabilities and we can bring our ideas and our philosophy into an environment and actually execute it in a way that allowed people to be much safer. So things that you've heard people talking about here today, like NotPetya and WannaCry and all of the theft of intellectual property from nation states, et cetera. The opportunity to be there and actually play a role and actually have an impact and create within organizations the ability, giving them the technical capabilities to disrupt these attacks was really important to me. So I made that switch. It's been an incredible time for me. And I think from a cybersecurity perspective, to see some of the changes that have occurred in the last 4 or 5 years has been really heartening. And then we get to where we are today. And I heard Adam and Dimitri earlier. Rob Joyce spoke. During this last panel, we heard about some of the adversary capabilities and their techniques, their ability to use existing capabilities in an operating system to avoid detection, signature-less attacks, file-less attacks, where the adversaries are able to very, very quickly, stealthily gain access to an environment, move laterally through the environment, exfiltrate data out of the environment, oftentimes without being detected. And when they are detected, much of the time it's too late. Where the adversaries have moved into attacks that are disrupting organizations, and we heard about a lot of the ransomware, where municipalities can't function. They can't do their day-to-day jobs because their network doesn't allow them to do it once it's encrypted. Or where we've seen nation states engage in destructive attacks that have significantly impacted companies from an economic perspective, but more importantly, from an operational perspective, where the ability for companies to do their day-to-day work is turned off, where whole portions of networks are shut down for days or weeks or months, rendering them inoperable. So everything that we do and everything that we have done, moving our capabilities to the network, allowing us to be more effective and more efficient, is for naught, because the adversaries have the capability to turn that off. So that is kind of the environment that we're in. And I wonder how we take all the things we talked about today, taking a lot of what I've said, kind of my prior life, 24 years in the government, now seven and a half years in the private sector. Where do we find that merger? What's the sweet spot? Where can there be efficiencies gained? And it's very interesting listening to the last panel. I've worked with Aaron for many years in the Bureau. I've known Ann and Jeremy, and these are folks who have dedicated their lives to public service, a good portion of their lives for sure. And there's a lot of great ideas here. But I think there's also lots of room for opportunity. It doesn't mean anybody is doing anything wrong necessarily. I just think that there's always room for improvement. There's always room for us to get better. All of us, as individuals, as groups, as teams, there's always opportunities for us. We have to actually do that. We have to iterate and be better and to be faster than the adversaries, because they are constantly innovating. And unfortunately for us, they don't have to abide by the same rules. They don't have privacy concerns, right? They don't have to abide by judicial process, and they don't have to ensure that they've got search warrants or that they've talked to a judge and they've laid out probable cause to believe that they should have access to the environment. They turn on a dime. Their innovation and their capabilities, the speed by which they move, and we talked about speed here in the last session, the speed by which they move is oftentimes, most times, difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. So the challenges are substantial. Within the private sector, or the public sector rather, I recognize what those challenges are. Having been in the Bureau, again, part of developing U.S. government policy and strategy, which I'll talk about in a minute, having operated from a tactical side, from a strategic side, the operational piece of all this, and then working with the defenders, the CISOs and those that are required, charged with the responsibility to protect the environment. Those challenges are high when you've got an incredibly diverse workforce spread out over around the world, because there are U.S. government computers that are global, sitting in embassies around the world and elsewhere. But millions of endpoints. You've got an extensive supply chain that's difficult, if not impossible, to completely secure. You've got a lack of continuity and coordination because you've got so many civilian agencies and DoD agencies. There's oftentimes a lack of coordination for a lot of different reasons. You've got a transitional workforce oftentimes, folks that are looking to move to the private sector because they feel that there's better compensation there. You've got a bureaucracy that is just a natural course of government organizations, and you've got really the reporting chains, which I think is one of the biggest challenges, the communication, and how that sometimes is fractured and doesn't always enable some of the intelligence sharing and some of the collaboration that I think is required. It's certainly not an indictment of the people, because I've worked with amazing women and men, and I got to tell you, I was very happy to see 3 women sitting up on this panel, because we need more women in information security. So it's not an indictment. I've worked with those people for many, many years, and I can tell you, and many of you here in this room, probably most of you, missing weekends and holidays and kids' birthdays and anniversaries, and really doing what you wanted to do because it was right for your organization, it was right for your country, but it impacted your personal life. So it's not through a lack of effort. It's unfortunately just the mechanism which we happen to find ourselves in a large government, a behemoth, and then even within these individual agencies. So what are the types of things that organizations can do? I can tell you, kind of at a high level, what they can do. The key really is actually executing it. That's the challenge. So, shrinking the footprint of the network, trusted internet connections, closing them down so that you've got less to defend, better asset management, working within human resources to develop the proper culture that allows people to want to stay where they are, to build career paths for employees, to ensure that you've got good compensation plans for them, a sense of purpose and mission, which is so important to keep people tied to that, to the organization, making sure people are properly trained, making sure that you're eliminating critical vulnerabilities. There's so many things that organizations can do to be better. At a high level, but at the end of the day, it comes down to having the proper organization in place. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The private sector approach, and what can the government learn? I can tell you this, when I was in the government, all I heard was about how great and effective and efficient the private sector was, and that ain't true. there's a lot of inefficiencies and ineffectiveness. And I've worked in a lot of companies going in, helping organizations and trying to get them back on their feet, helping them prepare their enterprise, helping them ensure that their environment is appropriately set for when they face the ultimate attack by adversary groups. And it's just not the case. There certainly is bureaucracy. There's issues with procurement. There's issues with stovepipes in organizations and problems with the attorneys want to get involved. And there's contractual issues. There's a lot of bureaucracy in the private sector. Again, it's the nature of human beings sometimes, and there's a lot that can be done to make that better. But one of the things I did learn early on is that the organizations that I have seen that have been successful are organizations that understand what the risks are. They understand that there needs to be a sense of urgency, that because of the risk, there needs to be a quick response. They understand about the importance of ensuring their people are focused on the right process. They understand the need to prioritize because, as Adam said, you can't focus on everything. If you focus on everything, you're not focusing on anything. You've got to focus on priorities and get them in place. So there are some really good things there within the private sector. But the essential practices within these organizations, things that you have to have in place, are the intelligence piece. I know we heard on the last panel, I really was happy to hear a lot of the conversation about what the intelligence needs to look like, how it needs to be executed, how organizations need to better prepare in advance, strategically, but how do you tactically use the intelligence so that you can action it. Adam talked about intelligence early on, and he talked about things that have happened in the past and people saying that's intelligence. That certainly is valuable. We need to have intelligence, look at what happened in the past, right? Aaron talked about sanctions on Iran prior or after sanctions were issued on Iran. We knew that they took certain actions, denial of service attacks against the financial services sector. That happened in the past, but that's good intelligence. It's a predictor for what might happen in the future. But how do we find the intelligence on the front side that allows us to take steps today so that we can disrupt the adversaries' capabilities? How do we do that? And it is probably the most undervalued, although I hear people talk about it all the time. You know, they talk about we need to share intelligence, and they say public-private partnerships. All really good. Most of the people who say it, many of the people, I wouldn't say most, many of the people that I hear say it, it's a talking point, and it sounds good, and they know others have said it, so it must be something to it, but they actually haven't done it. I worked in an intelligence agency. I collected intelligence for more than 20 years. I've executed against intelligence to prevent attacks in the physical world. I've done it in the virtual world. Many of you have done it as well. It's so critically important. But there's a gap between what we're doing in the private sector and the public sector. I want to get to that. You can't defend what you can't see, and you can't defend against adversary tactics and capabilities if you don't know what they are. So that intelligence is absolutely fundamental piece. The second piece is the hunting piece, and we've heard some folks talk about it today. I've got to reiterate it. After 9/11, the Bureau made some significant changes as an organization because it was very clear that you can't wait for the bomb to go off and then piece together the puzzle to figure out who did it. That in and of itself isn't enough. That's certainly important. But you need to be able to see around the corner what's coming, look for the indicators of an attack coming, and be able to disrupt the adversary's intent in advance of it actually happening. And the speed by which we operate. I was glad, again, the last panel, very, Ann and Q, some really important points they made about speed. Speed is key. You heard about 11060 earlier today from Dimitri. We've got to get inside the adversary's OODA loop. And I use that term because I haven't used it in about 6 years, but George actually, when I was talking to him back in 2011 about coming here, started talking about the OODA loop concept. Observe, orient, detect, or observe, orient, decide, and act. OODA. It's a training program used by fighter pilots. Observe the adversary as you're flying. Observe what's around you. Orient yourself when you see what's there so that you can identify it. Is it friend? Is it foe? Is it one plane? Is it 5 planes? Do I decide? Do I flee or do I engage? Act, and then you act upon it. Unfortunately, the adversaries' OODA loop is really fast because a lot of what they're doing is automated, and a lot of the intelligence we've talked about collecting is human-enabled and human-actioned, and we've got to get to the point where it's all being automated. A lot of it is being automated. We certainly use human collection, human intelligence to inform our actions, but we've got to get inside the adversaries' OODA loop to disrupt them. Because if they're on the network for 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, and I've been in environments where adversaries have been undetected for 2 years, we're in trouble. So that speed is absolutely critically important. So what are the proactive strategies? When I think about the U.S. government and some of the time that I spent early on in my career from a cyber perspective, I think in an ideal world, it would be wonderful if we had some type of a central command and that there was accountability and from a funding perspective, accountability from an operational perspective for all things to be coordinated so that you'd be able to realize efficiencies and effectiveness, the offense informing the defense, the ability to ensure that there was consistency in the type of defensive measures that were being deployed, and a much greater and effective use of intelligence back and forth between organizations, between enterprises. That would be wonderful. That's not going to happen anytime soon, I don't think. Funny, yesterday reading an article, I think it was GAO that put out, back in 2018, a list of things the government needed to do in order to be better prepared for cyber attack. And they said the first thing is you have to have a plan, a comprehensive plan, they said. 2007 worked to build a comprehensive plan for the U.S. government that was signed off by every agency head and funded by the government to the tune of $10 billion US. So we had a comprehensive plan. As part of the GAO's story, in addition to having the comprehensive plan, you've got to be able to ensure the supply chain is monitored. And you've got to be able to ensure you're able to manage new technologies that are being developed and prepare for them. And you've got to be able to train your employees, and you've got to be able to ensure that your workforce is best prepared. All things that were actually part of the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative back in 2007. 11 years later, the GAO says you got to do this. So I'm not confident it's going to happen anytime soon. Again, no criticism of the people that are here because I know what's happening, and there are very, very successful one-offs. And we've had lots of, and I'll talk in a minute about a couple of the investigations we've had that have been very successful. Erin mentioned a couple. She talked about Sony and the ability to get out in front of that, what happened after NotPetya, what happened with WannaCry, the government engaging with the private sector. So I don't think it's going to happen at the high level where we're going to have one person in charge across the entire government, civilian, military, coordination, offense and defense, informing each other so that they can be better prepared. And then from there, there's value to the private sector. That's not going to happen. But perhaps there's an opportunity for individual agencies, and that's why a lot of you are here. Opportunity for individual agencies and organizations to do a lot of this internal within your organization. It's not ideal because I think if it's done at the macro level, there's a lot more efficiency and a lot more effectiveness and a lot more capability. But let's say it's going to happen within your organization. What are the types of things that you can do? We already talked about intelligence. We talked about hunting, and we talked about speed. Having the right people, having the right technology, having the right capabilities. Is there an opportunity? When I hear about information sharing, intelligence sharing, the private sector has the indicators. Certainly the government is collecting indicators, and I know how they're collected. Oftentimes that's not getting into the private sector hands because of the way it's collected, it's classified, etc. But The private sector has all sorts of IOCs and IOEs, indicators of compromise, indicators of attack. Are there ways to get that into your agency? I think there may be. When people say we need to share intelligence, that's great. Tell me what it is you need. 3 things, folks. What it is you need. You want IP addresses, you want malware, you want hashes. What is it you need? This is the first thing. Second thing is, what are you going to do with it when you get it? How are you going to protect it? And the third thing is, what am I getting back? I think if one of you here comes up with this plan, I don't think it's, certainly there's a lot of complexity to it, but it's not that hard, okay? Actually, it's the other way around. It's not that complex, it's definitely hard. I think the concept is not that complex. Provide the infrastructure to actually allow for this intelligence to come into your agency, not the government writ large, but your agency. If you're at the Department of Energy, can you get that type of intelligence from energy companies, from NERC and FERC? Can you get that from agencies that are within your sector, coordinated with DHS perhaps? If you're in Treasury, is there an opportunity to collect from the financial services sector just within that small bucket? If you're in commerce, can you work with the retail sector to collect that type of intelligence? And maybe there's a broader way for agencies to share it. Just a concept, but when we talk about intelligence sharing, the private sector can't execute, other than defending their networks, proactively hunting and disrupting what's happening. They can't take the actions that this last panel talked about. They can't take sanctions. They can't enforce economic sanctions. They can't take diplomatic action. They can't arrest people. That's not happening. The government can do it, and the government's primary responsibility, any government's primary responsibility is to protect its people. Well, if the victims have IOCs, not unlike robbery victims have fingerprints in their house and photographs perhaps from their Nest camera, they can share it with the police to the action. It's not unlike that. Is there an opportunity to do that? So that's just kind of a concept. We've worked with the government previously in 2014, Game Over Zeus. The Department of Justice got judicial action in order to take down the infrastructure that Game Over Zeus, that was supporting Game Over Zeus. And we actually disrupted that botnet for a little while to allow the government to actually go in and take over the infrastructure. So good example of private sector coordinating with the US government. We also, the Kelios botnet back in 2017, where there was a guy who was operating that botnet, working with the FBI and the Department of Justice and Spanish authorities. We were able to actually disrupt that botnet while this guy was arrested in Spain sitting on the beach. Right? So there certainly are lots of examples. Those are one-off examples. But I think that if we're really going to have a true impact on this threat, on this risk, that aperture has to be opened up a little bit. Because private sector, all we're doing is protecting private sector networks. Government has the ability to take actions that take people off of the field and can absolutely disrupt other government strategies and change their policies. Change the way they think about this. Make it more difficult and more costly so that they think twice before they access a US network, a commercial network, that they think twice about it, because there's going to be some payment on the other side, and it's not cost-free. There's something to that. I'm reminded of a story when I think about how we all need to come together in this collaborative way. Back in 1961, President John F. Kennedy was in front of a session of Congress, and he talked about the U.S. by the end of the decade putting a man on the moon, which was an incredibly ambitious feat, and it was incredibly challenging and difficult, and a lot of people thought it would never be done. And back about a year later, President Kennedy was touring NASA, and he was with a tour group with a number of executives from NASA, and he saw a guy walking with a broom a few feet away, and he stepped away from the tour group and he walked over to the guy and he said, "Hey, I'm Jack Kennedy. What do you do here?" And the guy turned around, surprised to see the President of the United States standing there, and he got a big smile on his face. And he said, "Mr. President, I'm helping to put a man on the moon." Now, a lot of people saw a janitor who was really there to clean the building. because that's what he was. But he recognized his role in the bigger picture. He recognized what was happening around him, and that if the US was going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, then everybody had to come together, and it didn't matter what your role was. You were participating, you were part of the mission. You were going to do something to change the world and to change history. And it really makes your job feel a lot more important, that you're not a janitor pushing a broom, but you're working for something bigger. You've got a bigger cause. You've got the ability to help change the world. We have to do that here. We, if we're going to be successful, have to come together. Public, private, civilian, military, man, woman, it doesn't matter. We need to come together as a team. We need to collaborate with everybody in our organization to understand what the objective is. My objective at CrowdStrike, you ask anybody in my company, we stop breaches. 3 words. That's what we do. Everybody knows the mission. It doesn't matter if they're an accounts payable, the sales team, the marketing team. It doesn't matter. My team deployed, forward deployed, fighting Iran on the keyboard on some customer environment. We stop breaches. That's what we do. We need to do that in all of our organizations. We need to come together collaboratively with our partners, whether you have contractors, other CISOs and other organizations that you're working with. We need to work internationally, because this is not a US issue. This is a global issue. And we have partners around the world, and I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with those partners in Australia and Great Britain and in Canada and New Zealand, elsewhere, side by side, on some major issues that impacted not just us but them. It's about standing on a line and holding that line, because if that line is breached, the consequences are really high. If there's a breach in that line and there's a hole, it doesn't just impact our credit card numbers. It doesn't just impact whether we lose the plans to build, the next widget. The ability for adversaries to destroy the environment, to shut things down, is catastrophic. The consequences are grave, and the impact is against our families and our way of life. I know the people in this room are doing what you do day in and day out because it makes you feel good, that you're making a commitment, that you're making a contribution. At the end of the day, this comes down to leadership. And every one of us, regardless of whether you actually lead people or not, have the ability to demonstrate leadership characteristics every single day. When you see somebody who's doing something stupid, challenge them. When you see somebody who doesn't care, laissez-faire, irresponsible, asleep at the switch, challenge them. We have a responsibility, not only to our organizations, we have a responsibility to the men and women standing on each side of us, a responsibility to our families, and a responsibility to our country. And if we don't take that responsibility seriously, bad things are going to happen. I challenge each of you to step up and do that. Step up and be a leader and help make this world a safer place. Thank you.